Notes the presence of a quorum pursuant to committee rules. Members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I, the chair announces that I may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote is ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Welcome to the first markup of 2024. I'm really looking forward to all the great work that we have ahead of us for this year. And it's fitting that we ended 2023 by marking up energy legislation and that we're starting 2024 by marking up energy legislation. It's hard for me to think of an issue that's more important to our country than energy security. We can see the failures of this administration's energy policies everywhere we turn, and the president's decisions will have devastating impacts for generations to come. It's not hyperbole to say we will see ripple effects of these policies in every sector of our lives and livelihoods. Let's tick through a few of the arguments. The inauguration confetti was still falling on Independence Avenue when President Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, putting hundreds of skilled Americans out of work and ending the safest means of oil transportation that we have. President Biden yanked approval for the Twin Metals mine that's been decades in the making, cutting off access to one of the richest mineral deposits that we have in America, including cobalt. President Biden depleted the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in a Hail Mary attempt to lower exorbitant gas prices. Keep in mind, this reserve is designed to keep the U.S. afloat during an extreme emergency, not to bail out a president whose approval ratings are tanking. And we can't forget that President Biden canceled oil and gas leases in Alaska, cutting off a critical revenue stream for indigenous communities and negatively impacting a state that relies on access to resources for their livelihoods. Now, thanks to the worst offshore oil and gas leasing plan in history, we're starting the year without a single offshore lease scheduled. Want to know the last time this happened? That was 1958. Want to know what else the world was doing in 1958? The Soviet Union was electing Nikita Khrushchev as president. It's impossible to overstate the importance of energy security. While President Biden increases energy prices for Americans nationwide and kneecaps American industries and innovation, we're working here in the Natural Resources Committee to advance solutions that lift communities out of energy poverty and support domestic energy production. H.R. 5482, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act of 2023, is sponsored by Congresswoman Hageman and defines energy poverty as a condition in which individuals do not have access to affordable and reliable energy to maintain economic security. In the first year of the Biden administration, the amount U.S. consumers spent on energy grew over $3.1 trillion when adjusted for inflation. That's a 25% increase from 2020. Last winter, the number of households receiving government help to pay energy costs rose by an estimated 1.3 million to more than 6 million, the largest year-over-year increase since 2009. H.R. 5482 would require the Government Accountability Office to study laws, regulations, and state standards that impact at-risk communities and identify barriers to at-risk communities from accessing reliable and affordable energy. GAO would be required to issue a report to Congress on their findings, along with recommendations on how to reduce energy poverty in at-risk communities and steps each agency can carry out to increase energy access in at-risk communities. I commend Ms. Hageman for her work on this legislation and the important issue of energy poverty. H.R. 6474, sponsored by Congresswoman Steele, would amend the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to expedite geothermal exploration and development in previously studied or developed areas. Geothermal power is considered a renewable energy resource and is derived by capturing heat from an underground water reservoir or naturally generated steam under high pressure. The Department of Energy projects that geothermal power could provide nearly 9% of U.S. electricity by 2050. However, the duplicative leasing and permitting processes for geothermal development results in timelines that are longer than many other energy projects. H.R. 6474 would expedite geothermal development by amending the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to allow for new categorical exclusions under NEPA for geothermal energy. Energy security is national security, and I'm proud to be advancing these solutions that will put America back on the in charge and in the driver's seat, lifting struggling communities and putting our innovations at center stage. It's time for the Biden administration to work for American energy, to get out of the way of slowing down American energy so that our resources can thrive. I now recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's headliner is H.R. 5482, and we'll see yet again another Republican proposal to enrich oil and gas companies at the expense of consumers. The only thing new here is an attempt to market the bill as something that addresses energy poverty. But the majority are still pushing the same old policies, benefiting industry while opposing measures to lower energy costs. And the remainder of the opening statement, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent just to enter into the record and maybe talk about I think the function of this committee and where we're at. And I use the Republicans are in the majority. I recognize that. I've been on both ends of that in my tenure here in the House of Representatives. And with the majority comes certain prerogatives, setting the agenda, picking the witnesses, and deciding what legislative measures this committee is going to deal with. And we have made an effort as a minority to work with the majority, to prioritize, to try to find common ground. And on those, as we see today with unanimous consent, where there has been agreement, where there has been an accommodation to both sides, we go forward under unanimous consent. The points of difference come on the two items that will be dealt with separately. I say all that because that's the function of the committee. What I'm concerned about is that this committee continues to politicize every matter that comes before us. And yes, we have a robust debate that needs to happen in front of the American people. A robust debate about the future of the environment, climate change, and its effect on the American people. But let me use an example. It is my understanding that proposed there be a field hearing, an official field hearing by the committee in Arizona, my home state. The field hearing ostensibly to deal with immigration, at what level and what context, I don't know. And I mention that because our staff notified your staff, Mr. Chairman, that the dates for that hearing were at the same times as the Democrats are holding their issues conference. The norms of the past, which don't need to apply, as we're seeing, are that those days are spared hearings and actions so that respective parties can have their conference with their caucus. We asked that courtesy and that norm be extended to the minority since we are having that conference at the same time, and we were told no, that the hearing would go forward. I mention that because the participation of the minority, regardless, on an issue as critical as immigration, as divisive as immigration, as politically fraught as immigration, needs the presence of everybody there. But we've been denied that participation. And left to the Democrats to either cancel their conference or members of this committee who are playing a role in the organization of that conference could not participate. I really think that to create a political spectacle in southern Arizona with 4 or 5 witnesses, there'll be a county sheriff, there'll be a rancher, there'll be an expert from a policy shop affiliated with the Republicans, and we will get one witness that'll be berated, ridiculed, and dismissed, and once again to stoke the issue of immigration as a political advantage. You know, the speaker just said that we're not going to deal with any issue of immigration until Trump is president, which tells you that this whole field hearing is entirely about performance, about politics. I regret that we will not be able to participate in that hearing. I regret that our presence and our voice will not be at that hearing, because the common courtesy and the common norms of extending to the minority, I understand that we're not on equal footing. We're in the minority, barely, I should note, but there is an issue of fair play here, and extending to a significant part of the American people opportunity to have their representatives there, to have that point of view heard, and to provide some balance to a hearing. It's going to be the same thing that's happened every time everybody goes to the border. I mean, you guys should get frequent flyer miles for all the time you've been down to southern Arizona, to the border, had a press conference, had a rally, and moved on. But I find it particularly concerning, Mr. Chairman, that committee resources on an official hearing are going to be utilized for precisely that purpose, a political rally, and to continue to deal with immigration as a primary campaign issue for the Republicans in 2024. The speaker's already said we're not going to do anything. We're going to continue the chaos. We're not going to find any remedies. We're not going to seek common ground on this issue. And to me, this kind of marks, I think, where this committee is and where it's going and where it's going to continue to go. So, you know, I think President Clinton once said that Republicans are bold and loud, and Democrats are right and weak. But in this instance, Mr. Chairman, we feel that that being pushed into this situation, being dismissed and being made a non-participant in an official function of this committee is going beyond the pale. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I once again make a formal request that that hearing be moved, and that the members of this committee who want to attend and need to attend be given the opportunity to do just that. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege. I do appreciate the ranking member's willingness to work on some of the bipartisan legislation that we'll be approving in this markup today, and regret that the ranking member feels the way he does about our field hearing in Arizona. We've had multiple field hearings, and only the field hearing we've had in Guam have we actually had our friends across the aisle be concerned enough to participate in those field hearings. My understanding is there actually may still be one member from the Democrat Party to attend our hearing on the border. The border is a tremendously important issue. The reason we have to focus on it so much is because this administration does not focus on it. And the record numbers of migrants coming into our country that are affecting every nook and cranny of our country, the amount of fentanyl that's coming in that's killing our young people, it's something that's important enough that we need to be talking about it every day. And as I'm sure the ranking member understands, having chaired the committee before, there's only so many weeks in the year, and especially weeks and times when we can do field work. And in order for us to get this field hearing in, the schedule dictates more than anything else when we must do it. With that being said, pursuant to markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 5482, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act of 2023. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Ms. Hageman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about my bill, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act. This bill is about transparency. It's about the federal government doing its part to let the American people know just exactly what federal rules and regulations mean to them. America must have accessible and affordable energy, and coal, oil, and gas, and uranium are three of the most important resources we have to meet our demands. These resources are needed now and will be needed for generations to come, with demand only increasing over time. Anyone who claims otherwise is being dishonest. The key question that we must address then is who is going to be producing our energy? Our fellow Americans using our very own resources here, or foreign and often hostile countries who do not now and never will have our best interests at heart? For the Republicans, the correct answer is obvious. For the Biden administration and Democrats, however, the answer lies not in using our own abundant energy resources and controlling our own destiny, but in offshoring energy and mineral production to third world and dictatorial countries who care nothing about protecting the environment. The Biden administration, our friends across the aisle, prefer to rely on coal from China and oil and gas from Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, anywhere but here. Their preferred energy policy is one that empowers, enriches dictators, despots, and tyrants. Their preferred energy policy is one that destroys our access to the use of safe, clean, reliable, and affordable energy that is found right here in Wyoming, Alaska, Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, among others. Their preferred energy policy is one that is designed to increase the cost and decrease the availability of the very building blocks of a civilized society, including food, housing, concrete, fertilizer, transportation, and manufacturing. In short, their preferred energy policy involves the destruction of our communities, our businesses, our prosperity, and our very way of life. Their preferred energy policy is one that establishes energy poverty as the cornerstone of our society, where blackouts, intermittent power, and third world conditions define our day-to-day existence. The Biden administration has promulgated many regulations that negatively impact vulnerable populations' access to affordable and reliable energy sources. Energy poverty is defined in my bill as, quote, the condition in which individuals do not have access to affordable and reliable energy to maintain economic security, end quote. Countless Americans are dealing with energy poverty today as a direct result of bad public policy originating from the executive branch and from Congress. On day one of his presidency, President Biden declared war on domestic coal, oil, and gas and has been responsible for promulgating rules that raise energy prices for Americans ever since, starting with the cancellation of the Keystone Pipeline and expanding the use of the government-created social cost of carbon metric to artificially increase the regulatory costs of energy production of fossil fuels when performing analyses. The left is not serious when it comes to energy policy. Elitists have the luxury of not having to care about affordability or reliability, unlike ordinary people throughout this country. The left has continuously perpetuated a false narrative that energy producers are somehow causing poverty. They cite price gouging, but then they attempt to centralize the energy market by raising royalty rates and bonding fees in an effort to cripple competitions. Actions like this demonstrate that they are not serious and they do not practice what they preach. Mr. Chairman, my bill does not focus on an artificial manufactured narrative, but rather looks at the cold hard facts and the impacts on the pockets of the people in America's most vulnerable communities. My bill does a few important things to improve transparency. The Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act requires the CBO to estimate the effects on energy prices from any bills or resolutions coming out of Congress. It requires the GAO to conduct an analysis of energy laws and rules as well as state energy portfolios and standards to determine how they impact at-risk communities and identify barriers and develop criteria to determine if a community is experiencing energy poverty. It requires federal agencies promulgating energy rules to be honest about whether or not their actions disproportionately impact vulnerable communities when it comes to energy prices or increase the likelihood that these communities will experience energy poverty or job loss. And it allows project sponsors to request an energy poverty study on their project so that they can see how their requested project is likely to create jobs and reduce energy prices. Finally, the bill requires agencies to certify that their proposed actions will not result in energy poverty in at-risk communities before they can carry out an action. This would specifically require them to display an energy poverty statement prominently on the first page of the energy rule or guidance. Mr. Chairman, the purpose of this legislation is to show the American people how our decisions in Congress and regulations coming from the executive branch impact the lives of everyday Americans. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I thank you and yield back.
The lady yields back. Is there anybody else wish to be recognized? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I speak to this bill, let me associate myself with the very eloquent remarks of the ranking member. It is disappointing, to say the least, that House Republicans who have sworn off any actual legislative solution to our border challenges until Donald Trump is president are elevating their incessant desire for performative political theater about the border over the norms of this committee and the comity that has always existed on things like scheduling field hearings in the middle of a Democratic caucus issues conference. It's bad form, it's bad politics, it's bad in every way, and it's just very disappointing. Back to the bill, it is no surprise, I suppose, that we're here marking up a bill that allows my colleagues across the aisle to use vulnerable communities as props to advance the craven agenda of big oil and gas, an industry that is rolling in record profits and enjoying record production here in the United States. This bill assumes that more dirty energy production will save the day against energy poverty, but it ignores the fact that energy prices, which can actually be brought down with renewables, the cheapest form of energy right now, and things like efficiency and weatherization are at least as important in the battle against American families' energy burden. And the energy burden is not an equal access situation. Often depends on income, demographics. Minority communities are always getting the short end of the stick due to historic disinvestment in those communities, and renters, often overlooked, are twice as likely as homeowners to face energy poverty. So this bill doesn't acknowledge any of that. It doesn't acknowledge the fact that climate change will continue to worsen even if this legislation is enacted, and that makes families' energy bills more unpredictable, makes budgeting a nightmare as temperatures rise. It is a battle between unsafe home temperatures or falling behind on other bills. It is a lose-lose for low-income families. Remember those brutal Texas winter storms? Initially, Republicans tried to blame it on renewables, and then reality and facts proved that that was false. It was a smokescreen. Most power losses came from frozen gas infrastructure. Heat also damages power gears. It makes our energy system less reliable than a long-term weather forecast. So despite the record oil and gas production, home energy prices are still rising. If drilling everywhere and exalting fossil fuels was the solution, you would think we would have lower energy prices right now, but we don't. Export policies and cost pass-throughs by utilities are the culprits. In fact, LNG exports are the ticket to higher energy prices and to more chaos for American consumers. Experts across the board confirm this, from the U.S. Energy Information Administration to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, even analysts at Goldman Sachs, energy experts, they all agree. LNG exports leads to higher energy prices and more volatility for American consumers. Study after study confirms that natural gas exports elevate energy prices, worsen energy poverty, and income inequality for Americans. So this legislation simply doubles down on a failed Republican energy strategy. Drill everywhere, worship at the altar of the fossil fuel industry, and when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So here we are at the issue of energy poverty, and really viewing these communities that are struggling with energy poverty as a political opportunity, as props. My amendment ensures that for a critically important issue like energy poverty, we have more tools than just the fossil fuel hammer. It ensures that the fossil fuel industry is not favored in our attempts to address energy poverty. It strikes every place in the bill where fossil fuel is given preference, and it inserts an analysis of policies like energy efficiency and tackling the problem of LNG exports. The entire premise of this bill is wrong. It assumes increased fossil fuel production is the key to affordable energy when in fact the opposite is true. It overlooks the significant negative external costs of fossil fuel development, including the climate crisis and localized pollution impacts, which is a critical omission when you're talking about something like energy poverty. Look, I'm all for tackling energy access, energy poverty, but let's do it in a smart way that actually solves the problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I rise to speak in support of H.R. 5482, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act of 2023. I want to first thank my colleague from Wyoming, Representative Hageman, for introducing this bill, which I am proud to co-sponsor. It is abundantly clear that the Biden administration's radical anti-energy and anti-mining policies are causing energy prices to grow out of control for Americans in every corner of the United States. What's even worse is the fact that these increased energy costs are regressive. They're having an outsized impact on lower income Americans than they do on higher income Americans. One of the first steps that we can take to shut down runaway inflation is to lower energy costs for Americans and reverse the Biden administration's anti-American energy and anti-American worker agenda. At a time when our constituents are facing out-of-control energy costs and out-of-control inflation, it is unacceptable that this administration, as well as some of my colleagues, are looking to enact policies that will make life even harder for Americans. The Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act will keep this administration and Congress accountable and help stop regulations or legislation that increase energy costs and increase energy poverty in the United States. This bill directs the GAO to conduct a study to identify existing laws or regulations that are impacting at-risk communities and their ability to access affordable energy. It also directs the CBO to review future legislative proposals and determine their impact on energy costs and energy access to these same communities. It directs this and future administrations to include an energy poverty statement on the very first page of future rulemakings, statements of policy or guidance documents detailing how they will not increase energy costs and increase energy poverty for at-risk Americans. Contrary to what my colleagues on the other side of the dais might argue, this bill isn't meant to benefit traditional forms of energy. This bill is all of the above. I have always supported an all of the above energy strategy. Let's support the development of all forms of energy, and we will let the best rise to the top. This bill helps do just that. This bill requires the GAO to review all energy rules that impact consumer prices, not just oil and gas or traditional fuels, as some of my colleagues have argued. If rules or policies meant to benefit renewable energy projects would lower costs for American consumers, that GAO review would highlight it. Once again, this bill is an all-of-the-above energy bill. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield to Mr. Tiffany.
If I may ask a question of the gentle lady that has authored this amendment, it appears to me that this is a fairly simple bill in regards to, it's just seeking to get information to the American people. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir, it is.
Yeah, so I don't see why we would not support this bill, why anyone shouldn't support the bill. It's always about transparency and accountability, right?
That's
We
correct.
should be seeking to get more information to the American people, and that's all that this accomplishes. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I yield back to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Chair, I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Energy poverty is a problem, and so is the exposure and vulnerability to the effects of pollution on frontline communities across this country, from energy-producing businesses, corporations that have jeopardized up to 40 million Americans across this nation, their public health, their economic vitality. And right now, hundreds of thousands of families all across this country are facing dangerous power outages because of extreme winter storms. In my home state of Arizona, 2023 was the deadliest year on record because of record heat. At least 579 people died from completely preventable deaths. Weather is getting more unpredictable, more deadly each year as the climate crisis worsens. It's unacceptable, and more oil and gas is not the answer. Americans need access to reliable energy to stay safe in extreme heat and cold. They need the federal government to step up and address the climate crisis They need us to rein in pollution so they can live and breathe freely. But what solutions are Republicans offering? Nothing but handouts to oil and gas industry dressed up as concern for at-risk communities. It's a real load to see a bill named as if it addresses energy poverty, but that doesn't do so. It doesn't do so at all, and instead it just helps the industry. My colleagues across the aisle say drilling more oil and gas will bring down energy prices for families struggling to pay their energy bills. If that were true, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. The United States is already producing record amount of oil and gas. And what is the result? Big oil rakes in historic profits, and home energy costs continue to go up. That's because of the price gouging and because the oil and gas we produce here doesn't stay here. It gets exported. The profits go to big oil, while American families are left with a higher energy cost, devastating pollution, and a worsening climate crisis. The bill is a smokescreen to try to hide these inconvenient facts. The so-called energy poverty studies in this bill are so one-sided, they are practically propaganda for the fossil fuel industry. They are designed to prop up big oil's falling reputation while slowing down any federal actions to transition away from fossil fuels that are causing these climate disasters and harms our health. Meanwhile, Republicans have repeatedly attacked real solutions to energy poverty, like the energy efficiency programs in the Inflation Reduction Act that are already helping families pay their energy bills. It's easy to see where the false solutions in this bill may have come from. The only endorsements for this bill are from the U.S. and Gas Association, from the Energy Workforce and Technology Council, which is a trade association for energy supply chain, and the Domestic Energy Producers Alliance, which represents onshore oil and gas exploration and production, and the Energy Poverty Prevention Project, funded by a marketing professional with a long history of advocating for the fossil fuel industry. As a comparison, I'd like to enter into the record this list of more than 300 local and nationwide organizations that endorse the A. Donald McEachin Environmental Justice Act for All legislation. Again,
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I oppose the legislation, urge a no vote, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon. Mr. Bentz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of words about the bill, but before I do, I want to mention, as a member of the Judiciary Committee and having spent all kinds of time going to the border 4 times, it astounds me that folks would suggest that a retreat's more important than looking at what's going on the border. I just returned from my 4th trip with 63 other Congress folks. Shocking is the right word for it. Between 8 and 10 million people across the border in the past 2.5, 3 years. 300,000 alone in December. And your retreat is so important that you can't go down and take a look. I'm guessing the issues are massively important that it would require that you not go down and look at what's going on. Talking to the Border Patrol folks and having them share with us the feeling of being overwhelmed with 6,000 to 7,000 to 8,000 people a day coming in to the facilities that have been put up at extraordinary expense to try to make sure everyone's cared for in the proper way. You know, it's a humanitarian disaster. Why wouldn't you be worried about the fentanyl that's coming across? Of course, it's coming across in lots of places, but certainly with our lack of control of the border being a part of it. Yes, your retreat's important, but for goodness sakes, this is an issue that truly needs attention, and we are doing our best as 1/2 of 1/3 of government to bring it to the nation's attention, and that's why I mention it now.
Would the gentleman yield for a question about Speaker Johnson's no solution policy on the border?
Actually, I won't yield, but I'll address it. Speaker Johnson said just this morning that the issue ultimately will be up to the president, but that doesn't mean that we stand idly by doing nothing. And he said exactly that. So whatever you're quoting, I'm sure it's not as recent as what I heard about 2 hours ago. So the point of the matter is that's hardly an excuse to do nothing, and that's why we've been working so hard on this issue. I want to turn my attention to Ms. Hageman's bill, which I think is an excellent bill, and I want to call out the fact that I think as written, it would apply to, and I hope it applies to, the CEQ's attempt to destroy the dams on the lower Snake River. Now, those dams have nothing to do with oil or gas. They have everything to do with clean power and about 1,200 megawatts of firm power and 3,000 a pinch to bail out California. Because when California gets in trouble, you call upon the Northwest to save you when your green policies fail, and they do. And so I'm just trying to say, one of the witnesses who sat right here just a couple of weeks ago and testified to the dramatic negative impact that higher rates caused by removing those dams would have on the poorest people in Washington state. Of course, this bill is designed to try to protect them. And so to say otherwise, to say that somehow it's a contrivance designed to help the fossil fuel industry is ridiculous. What it's trying to do is actually prevent people from driving the cost of electricity through the roof. And that's exactly what's going on the lower Snake River. And it's my hope, of course, that we will be successful in bringing that situation to the attention of the American people. Mr. Chair, I'm happy to support this bill, and I look forward to further discussion of it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? Mr. Tiffany, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield some of my time to the representative from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman.
Thank you. Wind and solar are often reported as being the cheapest form of energy, but we're seeing utilities continue raising their rates. When all the costs of putting wind and solar farms onto the grid and making it reliable are included in the cost, wind and solar are among the most expensive forms of energy. That's one of the reasons why electricity consumers paid 14.3% more for electricity in 2022 than in 2021. The myth of lower renewable energy costs stems from the idea of a levelized cost of energy, or LCOE. Levelized cost of electricity tells you the cost of the electricity, but only when the power source is generating electricity, so it ignores the cost of moving to a less reliable source. Almost all pro-renewable studies use this mechanism to make their determinations, which is why they are able to come up with the magical outcome of cheap renewables. The reality is that there is no such thing. The latest figures from the U.S. Energy Information Administration show that renewables received $15.6 billion in fiscal year 2022 compared to $3.6 billion for fossil fuels. Renewables, however, produced only 21% of total energy, and 10% of that was hydropower. From 2016 to 2022, renewable energy industries received nearly 5 times as much in federal subsidies than coal, gas, and nuclear. In 2022, 79% of all energy was produced by fossil fuels. Renewables, again, produced only 21%, and again, 10% of that was hydropower. The second largest recipient of subsidies, according to the latest EIA figures, are programs that provide support for lower-income Americans struggling to pay utility bills. So we are creating a scenario where the government creates a problem that the government then solves. What I've always said is that government is always trying to fix its last solution. The production tax credit, which is one of the key subsidies that wind and solar receives, is given in some cases where no electricity is even produced. The wind and solar industries never grew without these subsidies. If it's truly a good technology, it shouldn't need production tax credits to survive. Energy demand is increasing in the U.S. and the world, and the supply can't keep pace. Who is crippling the supply? The Democrats. Democrats have made it more expensive to produce the supply we already have through their policies that raise royalty rates and bonding fees, as well as through their efforts to stop continued oil and gas and coal leasing. Cowboy State Daily quote states that, as it turns out, you can't just turn up your wind and solar farms. You can build more of them, but 0 multiplied by any number is still 0. If there's no wind or sun, there's no energy unless you have fossil fuels. Renewables aren't helping us meet demand, and our supply isn't matching our demand. That's because of President Biden's policies. The purpose of this bill is to expose the cost, the actual cost of energy production through what you describe as renewable energy, as well as other energy resources. This is purely a transparency bill so that the American people know why their costs have been increasing and what the basis of and how the policies affect them. With that, I yield back to Mr. Tiffany.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would just conclude by saying, once again, we're seeing what's happening with the green fantasy, and all you have to do is look at this weekend in the province of Alberta, where EVs are not working, where it's so cold, where wind turbines cannot function because gear cases do not function when you get like 25 to 30 below. In the great state of Minnesota, that happened just a couple years ago. It's happening in Alberta over this past weekend. It truly is a green fantasy, and it does not work for America, and more Americans are finding that out every day. I want to address the issue that came up earlier in regards to the ranking member brought up pollution. And I think about the documents that underpin this this committee's work. And among the things said is the enjoyment of our public lands. Why are we going down to Arizona to see the impacts of illegal immigration in America? So we've got a few things that are going on, right? You have national security concerns when we see Syrians bringing IEDs across the border. When you have fentanyl, that's the #1 killer of young people in America at this point, and you have the largest human trafficking operation, perhaps in the history of the world, that is going on as we speak. But there's also significant environmental degradation that's going on our public lands. It would be unacceptable at any other time, except it gets in the way of illegal immigration and how they refuse to deal with it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? I recognize myself, and so if the Mr. Levin, I didn't see your hand. I recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin. Appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, and it's not even in response because this debate is circular. There's really no debate that Congress can have unless it takes some action. And what is occurring on the border has been occurring under a variety of administrations. But the urgency right now and the crisis right now, I think, demands that we do more than stoke the fire and create more chaos. I think it demands that we look at what needs to be done. And quite frankly, the only place in which some action can be taken to begin to relieve that crisis, to begin to deal with it, like the supplemental that has been requested by the administration, that is held up right now by the majority in the House, is one instance in which resources are needed to help to manage this crisis, and then long-term begin to deal with the reality of what our border policies are and what our broken immigration system is. And you can't do that by ignoring it. You can't do that by continuing to hope that the chaos gets worse because it turns into a better political advantage. Congress can fix it. The majority can deal with it honestly and upright and have the necessary debate in front of the American people about what needs to be done, but we're not doing that. What we're doing is hoping that this crisis on the part of the majority gets worse so that it becomes a political advantage. That's the reality. That's why we're here. There is no serious solutions being proposed by the Republican majority in the House. There is no serious effort at compromise or consensus, and we'll see when the Senate sends whatever they send over. How many Republicans, majority in the House, end up either supporting that or not supporting that? Those are the kinds of tests that we're going to see in the future, and what we're doing on the border in Arizona is just the same thing that's been done over and over and over in my home state and in South Texas. That is to make this issue a divisive political issue in the campaign and offer no solutions, because the worse it gets, the better for the Republican Party. That's the strategy. I think it's a failed strategy, and the consequences are on the American people and the people I represent that happen to be American citizens that live on the border and are having to endure the lack of action on the part of this Congress day after day after day. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Ms. Radewagen, do you wish to be recognized?
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Grijalva, as John McEnroe, the great tennis player, said many years ago, you cannot be serious. It's the policies of this administration. Just removing, or just implementing rather, Remain in Mexico would stop 70% of it. Just one policy change would stop 70% of it. Only 18% of Americans think that Biden's doing right by the border. Give me a break. We have H.R. 2. Would you agree with the bringing back the Remain in Mexico policy? Would you agree with that? 70% would be stopped immediately. And then we have a northern border, too, that's wide open. We have people coming over, we're catching on the terror watch list on the northern border, too. There's a border in northern Minnesota. I represent part of that. From Grand Portage to the western edge of North Dakota, 2 mobile Border Patrol agents will be on duty tonight, only 2, because they're forced to work during the day to in-process. So our northern border, many parts are wide open. To the ranking member and chair, it's the policies of this administration. His policies alone have devastated our communities. We're seeing it. And it's a bipartisan, there is a bipartisan solution. There's my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that represent Democrat districts are seeing the devastation, the overwhelming amount of push on our social services, on our hospitals, on our public safety. And I'll just go back to, again, what the great John McEnroe said, you cannot be serious. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? I recognize myself, and I will speak in favor of H.R. 5482, but along the lines of what's been said in the committee, I would agree with Mr. Grijalva that Congress does need to take action, that Congress needs to push the administration to change their bad actions. And I would hope that my colleagues across the aisle would invite their Senate colleagues to their issues conference and explain to them that the House has taken action. We passed H.R. 2. We have put solutions on the table. We've got additional legislation where we've taken action to address the border. So, yes, we need bipartisan focus on the border. And again, we thought highly enough of border security that we made H.R. 2, the Secure the Border Act, a priority, and we passed that, and we're still waiting to see if Chuck Schumer's even realized that the bill's in the Senate, because the Senate has taken zero action on it, and we got very little support from our colleagues across the aisle in the House when we worked on H.R. 2. But back to Ms. Hageman's bill, it's also been misconstrued. It sounds like it's some kind of a handout to the fossil fuel industry. And Ms. Hageman, I just wanted to ask you, is this bill, I know it doesn't promote a partisan program subsidy that's bad for people. It actually puts people over programs. But is there anything in your bill that calls out support for the fossil fuel industry or not support for other kinds of energy?
No.
So this is just a transparency bill where you actually do the math and see what the economic impact is on people who are affected by certain energy policies.
That's correct.
I'm glad you clarified that, because in my understanding of the bill, I thought it focused on an all-above approach as well. And I could see why people who have supported subsidies for certain types of energy might feel like this bill would threaten those types of energy when you actually do the real math. And it would fill a missing gap in the rulemaking process by requiring energy poverty to be considered before rulemaking can move forward. It defines energy poverty as a condition in which individuals do not have access to affordable and reliable energy to maintain economic security. We have seen energy prices skyrocket due to misinformed and nefarious energy policies that have come about from this administration. I've said many times the main problem with the Biden energy policy is it's just two things. It's physics and math. And we may not be able to help the physics of their energy policy, but we should certainly let the math speak for itself on what is causing energy poverty and what's helping people to afford energy. Again, I support this bill. I think it's needed. It's too bad it wasn't the law before a lot of these policies were put in place, because I think it would have highlighted some major shortcomings and issues when we put political science ahead of real science and start grasping at straws on how to fix our energy policy, and oftentimes make it worse than it was before we started. I yield back my time, and it's now time to consider amendments. And we're going to start with H.R. 5482, Amendment Number 1, and I recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, for the purpose of offering her amendment in the nature of a substitute, designated Hageman 186 A&S. Without objection, the amendment is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Is there, Ms. Hageman, you're recognized.
I just would urge, based upon the discussion that's already taken place, I just urge my colleagues to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5482, the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act of 2024. And with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the A&S? I recognize myself. This amendment includes a number of edits that improve the functionality of the underlying bill. The amendment would also eliminate the ability for political intervention with respect to the GAO report commissioned by the bill. The amendment ensures that agencies are required to not only certify that their regulations and guidance will not impact energy poverty, but also resource management plan revisions and other agency actions. This is important as we have seen the Biden administration lock up millions of acres of federal lands from energy and mineral development through resource management plan revisions. The amendment clarifies that if an agency is unable to certify that an action will not increase energy poverty for at-risk communities, the agency may not move forward with the action. The amendment also requires agencies to show their work when they do certify that an action will not impact energy poverty. This will help avoid agencies simply checking the box, as we have seen the Biden administration do time and time again, with regulatory flexibility analysis with respect to impacts on small businesses. I support these changes, which improve the bill, and I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the A&S and the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, it is now ordered to consider amendments to the A&S to H.R. 5482. I recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for the purpose of offering his amendment designated Grijalva Number 1. And without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many of my colleagues know, for several years, I have been working with Democrats on the A. Donald McEachin Environmental Justice for All Act, the most comprehensive environmental justice legislation in history. Our bill is informed by the belief that federal policy can and should achieve environmental justice, health equity, and climate justice for all underserved communities. And while I don't disagree that energy poverty is an issue, the underlying bill does not address it, nor can this issue be separated from those other inequities, especially from the cumulative public health impact caused by pollution directly from fossil fuels. My amendment would ensure that throughout the bill, the studies, agency actions, and scores all also include an analysis of the disproportionate health risks for at-risk communities that are associated with energy production. We know that acute cumulative impacts of exposure to pollution from fossil fuels can be devastating. Just last week, we heard from a witness from the Gulf testifying against more offshore oil and gas production because when there is more drilling, there is more refining and other petrochemical facility activity in her neighborhood. This industrial activity directly impacts her community's ability to thrive and to be secure in their health. There is no accountability on industry for these devastating burdens. Even when the sky in her neighborhood runs black with pollution, the companies say it's not a problem. There is no real incentive to clean up their mess or do the right thing. Her gas prices aren't any lower because she lives so close to the industry, but her healthcare costs are higher. And each time another polluting industry moves to an existing sacrifice zone because it is often the path of least resistance, it adds cumulatively to the harm. I am committed to addressing energy poverty, but unfortunately, the underlying bill does not address the problem. And what's worse, it would increase the health burdens for the very communities the bill says it is trying to protect. My amendment would bring some much needed focus on the public health costs of our outdated energy policies. I urge adoption of the amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Hageman, you're recognized.
Thank you. First of all, I do not believe that this amendment is germane to the underlying bill, but also this amendment is trying to do the very thing we've been talking about that so often results in bad energy policy, which is to stretch the meaning of energy costs as broadly as possible. I object to this amendment as it ignores the actual issue at hand, which is energy poverty. I come from an energy-producing state, and I've seen the good that comes from fossil fuel production. While one single well may be just a drop in the bucket to the federal government's $6 trillion budget, in my state, even just one new well per year has significant economic impacts. Despite all of the good that oil and gas and coal does for my state and the country as a whole, this administration continues to perpetuate an unprecedented attack against domestic production at our own expense. Meanwhile, global demand for these resources continues to rise. This administration has used the term environmental justice as a catch-all phrase for ensuring fair treatment of all people, regardless of race or income, when considering the effects of environmental laws and regulations. They define these efforts as, quote, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, end quote. Ironically, these efforts have been weaponized in ways that disproportionately hurt the very communities that they are supposedly trying to help. My bill allows the bad policies that hurt these communities to come to light. It's a farce to paint a picture of new fossil fuel projects as an attack on the health of vulnerable communities. I invite you to come to my home state to see how our work gets done. We don't have major health problems associated with the work that we do. What we do have is government-imposed poverty coming from the highest level. The messaging behind this amendment is not accurate, and it completely changes the intent of the bill, which is to require transparency as it relates to energy poverty. It sounds like some of us here fear the results of a study that reveals that Biden's policies aren't working for most Americans. We shouldn't be scared to know the truth. I urge the rejection of this amendment. Again, it is not germane, and it is not actually going to do what it claims that it would do. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I will address the gentlelady from Wyoming's exalting of fossil fuels and scapegoating of clean energy in a moment in connection with my amendment. But I want to circle back to my friend from Minnesota's invocation of the great John McEnroe. I am the self-appointed chair of the Congressional Tennis Caucus and am actually wearing little tennis rackets on my tie today, so I speak with authority on this subject. And I do not think it's fair to invoke John McEnroe's "you can't be serious" quote in connection with Republican border policy. In fact, I think he would be rolling in his grave, and he's still alive. That's how outrageously unfair it is. But I'm also confused because the gentleman referred to, he suggested an openness to policy reforms. President Biden has been signaling for weeks and months that he's interested in policy reforms, in reforming asylum policy, in other major reforms at the border. And House Republicans have told him to talk to the back of the hand. Your Senate Republican colleagues, the chairman referred to maybe House Democrats getting our Senate colleagues to our issues retreat. I think you folks need to talk to your Senate colleagues, because they've been working hard on a bipartisan comprehensive immigration package, and Speaker Johnson said, hard stop, no, dead on arrival. And it's not the first time this has happened. When I first came to Congress in 2013, a bipartisan comprehensive immigration package came out of the Senate, and Team Extreme over here in the House Republican Conference, killed it because they don't want solutions. As bad as it gets, as chaotic as it gets at the border, there's more political value in the fear and chaos and drama from a border crisis to Republicans. That's what matters. Solutions don't matter. The House Republican Conference is where immigration solutions come to die. That is the way it's always been, and that's the way it is right now. And if you want to prove me wrong, listen to your Senate colleagues. Get serious about a bipartisan compromise, and don't just play out this script from Team Extreme. The same old thing where it's political theater all the time, but never solutions. This House Republican Conference is where immigration solutions go to die. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to the amendment offered by my colleague from Arizona. The amendment before us simply seeks to derail this bill by adding an unnecessary provision to evaluate public health impacts. We all know that the safest, cleanest energy production around the world comes from the country with the strictest environmental, safety, and labor standards, the United States. We also know that when we shut down domestic energy production here in the United States, we're simply increasing our reliance on energy from foreign adversarial nations. You know what those foreign adversarial nations don't have. They don't have strict environmental or labor standards. Last week, during an Energy and Minerals Resources Subcommittee hearing, some of my colleagues on the other side of the dais incorrectly asserted that energy production in the United States, specifically oil and gas produced in the offshore Gulf of Mexico, is dirtier than other sources. In fact, barrels of oil from the Gulf of Mexico are some of the cleanest barrels produced around the world. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of the Biden administration. In the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's 2024 through 2029 proposed 5-year plan, the Biden administration noted that, quote, the outer continental shelf oil production has one of the lowest greenhouse gas intensities compared to domestic onshore and other global producers of oil, end quote. We can either produce energy here or simply offshore our energy production to someplace where we can't see it, someplace where we can turn a blind eye to terrible environmental and labor conditions. And I urge my colleagues to— The gentleman will yield.
So I appreciate those comments. I can't let that go by from the gentleman from California, and I hope he keeps repeating this narrative that President Biden is doing everything. He's ready for solutions and all the rest. He can take action right now, today, to secure the border. He's the one that unleashed the border. He closed Keystone XL on his very first day in office, and he opened up the pipeline for illegal immigration that's led to about 10 million people coming into our country illegally in every way, shape, and form that you can find. It is up to him. He can shut it down anytime. So I just say, keep repeating it, that President Biden can't do a thing. He can't do a thing because the American people see what is happening. They see what's happening when IEDs are coming across the border. Improvised explosive devices that took off limbs of Americans right and left over in the Middle East and Afghanistan are now coming into the United States via Syrians. The terrorist threat has never been higher here in the United States of America. You have the largest human trafficking operation that was unleashed on January 20th of 2021, probably in the history of the world. And then you have fentanyl. And if set aside those first two, if for no other reason, you would think a president would say, we need to secure the border when the #1 killer has become, of young people in America, has become fentanyl. And it's direct result of what's going on at the southern border. And by the way, we will hear about that from a sheriff down in Arizona when we make that trip down there, as well as the environmental degradation that's going on as a result of illegal immigration. Yep, poor Joe Biden. He can't do a darn thing about it, can he? I yield back to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Chair, I'll only add to that, Joe Biden's border policy has been a disaster. His border policy has been a disaster, and we're seeing it. Only 18% of Americans agree with him, and I think that, as I said earlier, just one stroke of the pen by allowing Remain in Mexico, it'll stop illegal immigration by 70% overnight, and he can do that in 2 minutes, and he refuses to do that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself, and I oppose this amendment as it would, as Ms. Hageman said, go beyond the scope of the bill. It would also be duplicative because this topic is already covered under NEPA, which requires agencies to study and minimize environmental impacts. Conversely, energy policy is not currently studied by federal agencies, or energy poverty is not currently studied by federal agencies, and we have seen many rulemakings under the Biden administration that would greatly limit domestic energy production and security, leading to increased costs for consumers. This bill aims to address the issue of energy poverty and should remain tailored to this topic, and it's for these reasons I oppose the amendment. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the questions on the amendment offered by the ranking member, Mr. Grijalva, designated Grijalva number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Grijalva number 1 will be postponed. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering his amendment designated Huffman number 2. Without objection, the amendment is considered read. You're recognized, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I spoke in my initial remarks about this bill regarding this amendment, and there's been some discussion about whether the amendment improperly, and I would say recklessly, favors fossil fuel while disparaging and ignoring the incredible benefits of clean energy. It is a problem with this bill. There's nothing about the climate crisis in this bill. There's nothing about energy efficiency or weatherization in this bill. Nothing about the very real problem of fossil fuel export policy, which contributes to high energy prices and volatility in this bill. All of that is off limits. So, if we really care about transparency and energy costs and energy poverty, and you're going to do a study like this, at least ask the right questions and don't rig it in favor of the fossil fuel industry. That's what my amendment attempts to fix. It's pretty straightforward. I will just close with this. There's been a lot of scapegoating of clean energy by those who've spoken in support of this bill, and I'd like to enter a couple things into the record, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter a letter opposing this bill from the Southern Environmental Law Center. And according to this letter, fossil fuel resources were the South's least reliable sources when the Southern grid needed them the most in recent years, making up the majority of unplanned outages during extreme weather events over the last decade. The letter further summarizes testimony from utilities and experts calling solar energy and energy efficiency the, quote, most cost-effective energy resource addition available to the Southern grid. So with unanimous consent, I'd like to enter that into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
And that's from December 20th of 2023. I'd also like to enter into the record an article from the gentlelady from Wyoming's home state that debunks a lot of what has been said in support of this bill, at least as it relates to Wyoming. This is from Cowboy State Daily. The title of the article is Rocky Mountain Power Claims Astonishing 30% Rate Increase Not Due to Renewables. That is their headline, not my editorializing. Experts told the Wyoming legislature that the utility's requested rate increase, quote, would have been $85.4 million higher this time around without renewables. That's interesting. And 95% of the rate increase is due to increased energy costs during times of peak demand, end quote. Fossil fuel prices, not renewables, are driving home energy price surges in the state of Wyoming. That is from November 12, 2023, again in the Cowboy State Daily.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge a yes vote on my amendment and yield back.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Hageman, you're recognized.
I oppose this amendment and also would state that, again, it is not germane to the subject of the bill that I have brought. If the gentleman from California would like to bring this bill, he's more than free to do so. This amendment shifts the conversation away from what the Biden administration is doing to vulnerable communities by raising energy prices to be about what they're doing regarding, quote, energy efficiency standards, and strikes the bill's important section that highlights state renewable portfolio standards. Let me just say I'm not surprised to see pushback from California on a study that exposes what their state has done on this topic. Declining grid reliability, however, doesn't have to be inevitable. Many states have implemented policies that favor politically acceptable projects more than policies that allow power companies to effectively serve people. Forcing companies, especially when there's a monopoly company involved, to implement new energy infrastructure to bring electricity to homes and businesses is expensive. Forcing the taxpayers to incur the risk is even more expensive. And then to see big energy companies raise rates because the projects they chose to invest in that may have been a political priority doesn't produce energy as reliably as they'd like is even more expensive. We're witnessing the domino effect of bad energy policy. And when you bring up Rocky Mountain Power, the irony is that they state without renewables, the rate increase would have been an additional $85.5 million. What they really meant to say is without the tax credits and subsidies associated with renewables, the rate increase would have been even higher. I'd like to have unanimous consent to submit this article entitled Green Energy, the Greatest Wealth Transfer to the Rich in History. And it states that we are in the midst of history's greatest wealth transfer. Government-subsidized wind systems, solar systems, and electric vehicles overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy members of society and rich nations. The poor and middle class pay for green energy programs with higher taxes and higher electricity and energy costs. Developing nations suffer environmental damage to deliver mined materials needed for renewables in rich nations. Since 2000, the world has spent more than $5 trillion on green energy. More than 300,000 wind turbines have been erected. Millions of solar arrays were installed. More than 25 million electric vehicles have been sold. Hundreds of thousands of acres of forest were cut down to produce biomass fuel, and about 3% of agricultural land is now used to produce biofuel for vehicles. The world spends about $1 trillion per year on green energy. Government subsidies run about $200 billion annually, with more than $1 trillion in subsidies spent over the last 20 years. The Inflation Reduction Act committed $370 billion to action on climate and energy, $370 billion in subsidies and loans for renewables and EVs. But renewable subsidies and mandates overwhelmingly favor the rich members of society at the expense of the poor. Wind systems receive production tax credits, property tax exemptions, and sometimes receive payments even when not generating electricity. Landowners receive as much as $8,000 per turbine each year for leases for wind systems. In England, ordinary taxpayers pay hundreds of millions of pounds per year in taxes that are funneled as subsidies to wind companies and wealthy landowners. U.S. federal subsidies of up to $7,500 for each electric car purchased, along with the additional state subsidies, directly benefit EV buyers. The average price of an EV in the U.S. last year was $66,000, which is out of reach for most drivers. Most electric cars in the U.S. are second cars for the rich. A mid-size electric car needs a battery that weighs about 1,000 pounds to provide acceptable driving range. Because of the battery weight, EVs tend to be about 50% heavier than gasoline cars, which causes increased road damage. But EVs don't pay the road tax included in the price of every gallon of gasoline. EVs should pay higher road taxes than traditional cars, but today this cost is borne by everyday gasoline car drivers. In January, California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, New York, and Washington proposed a wealth tax on on billionaires. It's interesting to note that all 7 of these states mandate and heavily subsidize wind and solar arrays and electric vehicles, which transfer wealth from the poor and middle-class residents to those same billionaires. The point is that your green energy is not cost-effective. The only way that it is cost-effective is with continuing massive amounts of subsidies from the American taxpayer. The point of my bill is to expose the actual cost of your green energy dream so that the American people know what it costs to subsidize the rich. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to the amendment offered by my colleague from California. I will reiterate some points I just raised during debate of the previous amendment. Once again, this is a Democratic amendment that simply seeks to derail the underlying legislation. This amendment adds a provision that would review the impact that a particular rule would have on American energy exports. It's an attempt to stop the export of not just American energy, but the incredible environmental progress we've achieved thanks to energy exports. As I just shared with this committee, energy produced in the United States is some of the cleanest forms of energy you'll find in the world. The progress the world has made in lowering global emissions over the past few decades isn't thanks to government policy, it's thanks to the increased use of natural gas for power generation around the world. Several of my colleagues on the other side of the dais are adamant on stopping American energy exports, including LNG. This is the same American natural gas that has enabled our global energy progress. But yet again, don't take my word for it. Do you know which administration supported ending the oil and natural gas export bans? It was the Obama-Biden administration. The Obama-Biden administration recognized the great benefits American energy exports have, not only for global environmental progress, but for the American energy worker and the American economy. The world can get its energy from cleaner, more environmental friendly sources like the United States, or it can rely on foreign nations opposed to the United States. Which should we be supporting? I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Levin, do you wish to be recognized?
Well, I don't know if my colleague, the chairman of the tennis caucus, wants to be recognized here, but what I would say is that the arguments around reliability and cost are not zero-sum. So I would hope that we would all share the goal of having a more reliable grid, a more cost-effective grid, lower costs for consumers. And I won't talk about California, but I will talk about Texas for a second. I could enter into the record an article just a couple days ago called "Why Texas's Grid Isn't Failing During This Year's Extreme Cold. Renewables and batteries are playing a part in keeping the power on." I think we all remember 3 years ago when more than 200 people died in Texas, and Governor Abbott blamed the state's windmills, but the biggest part of the problem actually came from the state's natural gas infrastructure, as some natural gas production and power plants stopped working and pipelines froze. Subsequent to that, Texas now has around 25% more wind power than it did during the Arctic weather in 2021, around 3 times as much solar production, nearly 3 times as much battery storage. And when temperatures recently plummeted, renewables and batteries played a part in keeping the power on. One quote, gas power plants have repeatedly been shown to be vulnerable to extreme weather, can cause dangerous problems for communities if the grid is too reliant on gas plants. A diverse set of clean energy solutions can help bolster grid reliability during extreme weather events, while also mitigating the global climate change that is exacerbating these extreme events. So while it's about 25 degrees outside, I thought it might be good to bring up that this is a bit more nuanced and complex, and it's not so zero-sum. And with my remaining time, I'd be happy to yield to my friend, the chairman of the tennis caucus.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and to use a tennis metaphor, there is an easy overhead that needs to be smashed here. When the best you can do to malign clean energy is to attack clean energy subsidies, you got a glass house problem, because it would take a lot, hundreds, maybe thousands of Inflation Reduction Acts to even scratch the surface of the massive fossil fuel subsidies that are global. But certainly the United States is the worst offender, trillions and trillions of dollars. Talking about wealth transfer, these subsidies have enabled the largest, wealthiest industry in the history of the world to rake in record profits at the expense, usually, of American consumers and certainly the environment. So, look, if you want to talk about subsidies, that's a easy conversation to have and win when it comes to comparing clean energy with fossil fuel energy. I thank you and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. And Ms. Hageman, you live in Wyoming. It's a very cold place in the wintertime. You still have some pretty nice coal plants out there. Have you ever seen a coal plant shut down because of cold weather?
No, sir, I have not.
Have you, are you aware of these subsidies that fossil fuel industries get?
No, and I disagree with the numbers that Mr. Huffman has provided. In fact, the latest data I have is for renewables in just 2022, it was $15.6 billion. I would call them unreliables, not renewables. It was $3.6 billion for fossil fuels. But just with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, $370 billion boondoggle for the so-called green energy transition.
Thank you, Ms. Hageman. The intent of this amendment seems to perpetuate the fringe and categorically false argument that energy exports increase prices domestically. And in fact, the opposite is true. A retrospective study published last summer by ICF on the 2015 lifting of the crude oil export ban found that lifting crude oil export ban allowed, and I quote, U.S. oil prices to converge with international benchmarks, spurring more drilling activity and leading to higher crude oil production, as well as higher production of associated natural gas and natural gas liquids that come from oil wells, end quote. And the report continues, I quote again, higher U.S. oil production expanded global oil supply, reducing global crude oil and refined product prices. Because there is free trade in petroleum products, the U.S. fuel consumers have benefited from these lower product prices, end quote. This should not be surprising to anyone who's taken an economics class that when you increase supply, that price drops. Trying to tie energy exports and fabled price gouging has become a popular talking point for those on the left, but the truth is that the Biden administration's anti-energy security policies, along with Putin's war on Ukraine, are the two main reasons we have seen energy prices skyrocket over the last 3 years. We must move forward with a strong energy dominance agenda across all energy sources. And I'm requesting unanimous consent to enter into the record a July 2022 report by ICF that I referenced called The Economic Benefits of Lifting the U.S. Crude Oil Export Ban, a Retrospective Analysis. Without objection, so ordered. Again, I oppose the amendment and I yield back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 2. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Huffman number 2 will be postponed. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, for the purpose of offering his amendment designated Levin number 53. Without objection, the amendment is considered read. Mr. Levin, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to start where I think we can all agree. I'm sorry everybody, or most everybody left, because I think there are some things we can agree on. I think we can all agree that all Americans should be able to access affordable, reliable electricity. I think that we can all agree that some communities, particularly low-income communities, shoulder this burden more so than others. And I want to thank my colleagues, I mean this, across the aisle for acknowledging the importance of keeping energy costs affordable for all of our constituents and all of our districts. I just think that we've got some different ideas of how to achieve that end. In my view, this bill looks at one solution that really is just one solution to energy poverty, to tap into fossil fuel resources and drill more. But I would offer it's not the only solution. And I would ask my friends and colleagues to keep an open mind about what I'm about to say, something that's not often done around here. But I think that we all know, whether we want to admit or not, that we need rapid and deep reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions because of climate change. It's not my opinion, it's the overwhelming scientific consensus. It's here, it's not theoretical, it's affecting communities all across the country. Between sea level rise, coastal erosion, increased frequency and severity of wildfires, drought, other extreme weather events, my district in particular, I invite you all to come visit anytime, is feeling the effects. And there are districts all across the country, Republican districts, Democratic districts. Again, it's not theoretical, it's here. Across the country, there were 28 weather and climate disasters in 2023, which surpassed the previous record of 22 in 2020. And there was a price tag associated with those disasters of $92.9 billion. Again, it's not my opinion. 2023 was the hottest year on record, not my opinion. And we already know how to fix this. We know how we can reduce emissions. We know how we can curb the worst effects of climate change. We know also how we can bring costs down for the American people, which is to accelerate our deployment of renewable energy and transmission infrastructure. And I'm pleased by what we did last Congress. We are seeing significant progress on the build-out of renewable energy, but as it stands, we need to do more around the reliability of our electric grid. And that would be true under any circumstance, but particularly around transmission. We don't have enough power lines built that can connect cleaner, cheaper electricity, yes, cheaper electricity from the remote parts of the country where the sun shines the brightest and the wind blows the strongest, to the homes of Americans where that power is going to be used. There are 2 million megawatts of clean electricity generation waiting to be connected to the grid. That's about double the current capacity of the grid today. Think of that. So we're on track to meet the needs of the American people as it pertains to clean energy, but we currently lack the ability to actually deliver that electricity to the American people. The Department of Energy found in its 2023 National Transmission Needs Study that there's a pressing need for additional transmission infrastructure and identified that transmission helps cost-effective generation sources like renewables meet demand in high-priced locations, thus helping to lower prices for consumers, which is all we all want. I'm glad the bill mentions transmission, and I've offered an amendment to better account for how renewable energy and electricity transmission are key to reducing energy costs, maybe the most important thing of all. My amendment would direct that as part of the Government Accountability Office's report on energy poverty, they analyze and include recommendations on how to increase renewable energy production on federal lands and how to improve and expand electric transmission infrastructure. Further, my amendment would require that prior to taking an action that would prohibit or delay rights of way for renewable energy and transmission or limit new lease sales for renewable energy, the Department of the Interior would conduct a study verifying that doing so would not increase costs for at-risk communities. Finally, my amendment would remove the attack on state renewable portfolio standards, or RPFs. These are important tools for states to diversify their energy sources and reduce their emissions, and frankly, I'm surprised that this was in the bill to begin with because I hear a lot of supports for states' rights from my colleagues. So if we want to reduce energy costs, we ought to focus on how to reduce the risks that the global oil and gas markets, which are extraordinarily volatile, pose to American energy consumers. To reduce costs, to insulate ourselves from that price volatility, we must transition to clean domestic energy and ensure that we have the electric transmission infrastructure to accompany it. And by the way, this will also be a tremendous economic opportunity in all of our districts. Red districts, blue districts, all benefit. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, which takes a holistic view of energy poverty by bringing clean energy and transmission into discussion. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Hageman, you're recognized.
This amendment is not germane. It has nothing to do with the underlying bill, and for that reason, it should be opposed. Wind and solar, setting that aside for a moment, wind and solar are often reported as being the cheapest form of energy, but we're seeing utilities continue raising their rates. When all the costs of putting wind and solar farms onto the grid and making it reliable are included in the cost, wind and solar are among the most expensive forms of energy that there is. That's one of the reasons why electricity consumers paid 14.3% more for electricity in 2022 than in 2021. In Wyoming, we've been faced with a proposal to raise utility rates by 30%. This was from a company that received millions of dollars in green subsidies. While green energy fanatics permeated the idea that these subsidies were actually saving us money in Wyoming, the reality is that we were threatened to pay for both unreliable energy sources through our taxes and our monthly utility bill. According to the Energy Information Administration, wind and solar combined produced just a little bit more than 10% of the electricity in the U.S. in 2021, and that doesn't count the other fuel sources that we need. Hydro puts renewables at just over 20%, but wind and solar put us at just over 10%, and it still receives 5 times as many subsidies as fossil fuels. We're paying for nothing, and that's why energy prices are skyrocketing, and all the subsidies in the world for electric transmission lines aren't going to fix the reliability problem. The fact is, when you obsess over this so-called climate crisis, what you're doing is engaging in hysteria that is simply not true. With China opening an average of 2 new coal-fired power plants a week, and India apparently more determined than ever to continue its development curve as the entire non-Western world, global CO2 emissions will continue to rise for the foreseeable future. There is not yet any available inexpensive alternative to fossil fuels. This increase in global CO2 emissions would be inevitable even if the West persists in its efforts to reduce emissions. Western reductions are and will continue to be more than offset by the increase in emissions in the rest of the world. Setting an example to regimes in countries around the world that often hate the West simply enables those countries to grow stronger, while the countries setting the example weaken themselves by committing themselves to severe economic disadvantage while having virtually no effect on the climate. Meanwhile, as they grow, they would doubtless be extremely happy to see the West hobbling itself. The EU and its member states have focused on climate policy, mobilizing enormous financial and human resources, thereby reducing the resources necessary for the development of its industry and weakening the security of energy supply. That's according to Jean-Pierre Schrecken-Willemeyers, the Thomas More Institute. Future generations will judge us harshly for allowing extremist environmental activism to enfeeble us in the West, while a hostile East, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, continue to advance their industrial and military capabilities. The IPCC AR5 Working Group 2, Chapter 10 states, for most economic sectors, the impact of climate change will be small relative to the impacts of other drivers. Changes in population, age, income, technology, relative prices, and many other aspects of socioeconomic development will have an impact on the supply and demand of economic goods and services that is large relative to the impact of climate change. In other words, according to the data of the IPCC itself, the economic growth and well-being in Europe and the United States are more threatened by extremist and delusional environmental policies than by global warming. This, according to climate change alarmism, is a lie and must stop. And finally, I would point out that South Africa's slashed emissions beat their climate goals, and the country is about to cease to exist as a result. The nation has already slashed enough emissions to have reduced output between 350 and 420 megatons of carbon dioxide by 2030, meeting the goal that they have set forth in the Paris Climate Accord. And what does that mean? That means that South Africa has now gone over 100 days with outages every single day. And they are collapsing. Most of the people of South Africa have lost access to refrigeration, education, communication services, medical services, and work. Over 2/3 of businesses have laid off employees or closed because of the power outages. That's where you're heading if you continue to go down this road of climate alarmism and extremism. This amendment is unnecessary. If you want to bring your own bill, feel free to do so. I urge my colleagues to vote against it. And for all of the reasons that I have stated, it is unnecessary. Thank you, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Levin, you're first.
Oh, you've already spoken.
Oh, that's right.
I'm going to
Mr.
help him out.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Levin.
Thank my friend. You know, I look at all these issues through the lens of my 2 children at home. My wife and I are very blessed to have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old at home. And I think a lot about the world that they're going to inherit, the habitability of the planet, the air quality and water quality that they're going to inherit. I know that the decisions that we all make will have a tremendous impact on them and on their kids and on children all around this country, all around this world. And I think it's sad, it's unfortunate that here we are in the new year 2024. We've had 4 decades of overwhelming scientific consensus going back to when I was a young kid. Again, it's not my opinion, it's not alarmism, it's the overwhelming scientific consensus, indisputable, overwhelming scientific consensus that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and extreme climate events are at record highs. With regard to subsidies, I think it's important to set the record straight on that. I'd like to enter the record some comments by my good friend, Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, as part of a budget committee hearing, where he says, in part, the United States subsidizes the fossil fuel industry with taxpayer dollars, not just the U.S., but according to the IEA, fossil fuel handouts hit a global high of $1 trillion in 2022, the same year big oil pulled in a record $4 trillion of income. In the U.S., by some estimates, taxpayers pay about $20 billion every year to the fossil fuel industry. But the really big subsidy is the license to pollute for free. The IMF calls this global free pass an implicit fossil fuel subsidy. Economists call it an unpriced externality. But behind these benign-sounding phrases is a lot of harm. Start with the harmful effects of local air pollution. Researchers from Harvard found pollutants from oil and gas combustion were responsible for 8.7 million premature deaths annually. The increased mortality rates from heat and air pollution that we know about. The OMB says that growing costs from intensifying disasters like wildfires, floods, droughts could cost $2 trillion annually and reduce U.S. GDP 3 to 10% by the end of the century. So you tally up these harms, these indirect subsidies, along with the direct subsidies, the IMF estimates that it is actually a $5.4 trillion annual subsidy worldwide. In the United States is $646 billion every single year. So I think it's important that we recognize the real story here, and that we try to, if we're going to compare subsidies, we need to compare environmental externalities. It's critically important that we're honest about the impacts, both positive and negative, of different types of energy generation. And with that, I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, designated 11053. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for a roll call vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the
Further proceedings on the amendment.
further proceedings on the amendment designated 11053 will be postponed. Pursuant to markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 6474 to amend the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to expedite geothermal exploration and development in previously studied or developed areas. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources be discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Ms. Lee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 months ago, America's first enhanced geothermal plant officially went online in my home state of Nevada. Today, it is actively producing carbon-free energy to power Google Cloud operations in Las Vegas, as well as data centers across the state. While this is exciting news, both for my constituents as well as for our planet, it's also exasperating, as it simply should not have taken until 2023 for such an economically and environmentally promising technology to get on the grid. DOE-backed experts have been emphasizing since 2006 that most of the key technical requirements to make enhanced geothermal systems work economically over a wide area of the country are already in effect. Yet, long-standing permitting process have left enhanced geothermal with some of the lengthiest development timelines of any power production technology, a reality that has been recognized and underscored by the Congressional Research Service. As geothermal scholar and spokesman Dr. Bryant Jones put it when I asked him during the legislative hearing last month on this bill, he stated, geothermal does not have a technology problem, it has a policy problem. DOI is correct in saying that HR 6474 is not a cure-all, but it is a bill that I am pleased to co-lead nonetheless, as it takes a bipartisan step in the right direction towards the kind of permitting parity for geothermal energy that Congress and multiple administrations have each been far too slow in delivering to date. Some of my colleagues on this committee are wary of legislative categorical exclusion, or CXs, broadly speaking, and understandably so. For their consideration, I would highlight a point best made in recent comments by the Wilderness Society, which has similar concerns about legislative CXs generally, but which supports HR 6474 specifically. Quote, they state, enlarging the scope of an existing categorical exclusion that currently only applies to a limited set of oil and gas activities to also apply to the same activities related to geothermal is laudable and is in service of the goal of permitting additional clean renewable energy on federal public lands. Advancing this timely, narrowly tailored legislation will help ensure that carbon-free geothermal is not held to a higher standard than carbon-intensive fossil fuels, particularly while Congress continues to work towards a more comprehensive permitting reform solution. I ask you to join me and Representative Michelle Steele in supporting HR 6474 accordingly. Thank you.
Is there further discussion on the bill?
Chairman.
Ranking members recognized, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying that I am supportive of the stated goals of this legislation. I am encouraged to see my colleagues across the aisle supportive of clean, renewable geothermal energy. Unfortunately, as it is currently written, this legislation would not help deploy it any faster or safer, so I'm opposed to the bill. This bill would amend the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which established 5 categorical exclusions. That is, exclusions from the specific NEPA requirements for oil and gas. This bill would extend these categorical exclusions to cover geothermal energy development as would include those as well. Although geothermal drilling is similar to oil and gas drilling, BLM testified at the hearing on this bill that they are different enough that the agency believes these categorical exclusions would not provide significant benefits for improving geothermal processing times. Moreover, federal agencies already have the authority to create their own exclusions, with a process that is more thorough than when we established those other exclusions legislatively. BLM is already working on administratively establishing categorical exclusions, which will be much more applicable and effective for geothermal energy. For these reasons, I oppose the legislation, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Is there further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it's now in order to consider amendments to HR 6474. No amendments have been filed. Are there any amendments? Hearing none, I move the Committee on Natural Resources favorably report HR 6474 to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Thank you. I give notice of my intention to file supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views on the measures just considered. I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all measures considered at this markup under House Rule 11, Clause 2L. This notice extends to all members. And yield back, sir.
Without objection, so ordered. We're in recess until after the first vote series on the floor. Yes.
Since we're at the point of unanimous consent, can I inquire as to the recess would extend till after the votes are taken at 1:30? Why do we need the additional time at this point? Huh? We still need these votes up here, but the unanimous consent ones would be what's next, correct?
That is correct.
And we will be taking a break till 1:30, correct?